Good afternoon and welcome to the 8th in our ongoing series of Behind the Book presentations produced for Caltech by the Public Programming Office. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I'm Michael Alexander. I'm the Director of Public Programming, and it is my great pleasure to hear that so many of you signed up to join us today. Behind the Book is Caltech's program that brings authors who are writing about science or science adjacent topics to our audiences, with Caltech faculty and other leaders, sometimes interviewing them, sometimes partnering with them in discussions about the books that have been recently written. I want to start by thanking the Caltech Workers Federal Credit Union and the Friends of Beckman Auditorium for their ongoing support of the programs that Public Programming produces. If you are interested in becoming a donor and helping us bring more programs to youth, we start our Science Journeys series for high school and middle school students this Friday with Science Journeys. You can join the Friends of Beckman by going to events.caltech.edu, and it'll give you all the information you need about how you too can become a friend of the Beckman Auditorium programs. You can also see the image. Let me see where I have to move so that you can spot it right there over my left shoulder. You'll see the address as well. Coming up in May, on the 17th of May, we're going to be featuring David Anderson, the Seymour Benzer Professor of Biology and the Leadership Chair and Director of the Tsien Chow and Chrissy Chen Institute for Neuroscience here at Caltech. He has a brand new book that just came out. It's called The Nature of the Beast. And any of us who have pets or are fond of animals keep wondering, do animals have emotions? And he attacks that question in this book. And it's going to be a very, very interesting interview on May 17th, 5 o'clock. And he'll be meeting with Caltech Professor Ralph Adolphs as well. We're going to be starting up another aspect of this series in July when we work with Caltech's Tom Mannion to look at the science of cooking. So we'll get more information as we're able to solidify a date and work on certain other specifics. But if you sign up for our mailing list, you'll be able to join us for that program as well. Books and ideas come to us from a lot of different sources. I want to thank Wendy Prober Cohen, who contacted me. She's a pianist here in town, and we were talking about a music program when she brought up today's book. And it's ideas that get thrown over the transom that sometimes end up on our program. So if any of you have ideas or know of great books that you think would be worthy of this program, please send us a note at events@caltech.edu. So Fraser MacDonald is the author of this absolutely fascinating book. It's a page turner. It's accessible to all levels of science education, and I know was a very valuable book even to the historians and staff that are keeping track of how did JPL get created. You'll hear more about that from Eric Conway, JPL's historian, and you'll hear later on from Peter Calliope, who is Caltech's archivist. Fraser wanted to be with us, but unfortunately, as a faculty member at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where the faculty are on strike, he just did not feel it was right for him to be crossing a picket line. I'm going to have a statement from him momentarily that he wanted us to share with all of you. But he pre-recorded this interview with Eric, and we're going to be able to share that with you just in a few moments. What he wrote to us was, "Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. It's a privilege to talk about the book with Eric Conway and to address the Caltech audience. I'm only sorry that I can't do it more directly. By way of explanation, I need to say that I'm a member of the Universities and Colleges Union in the UK, and unfortunately this week we are on strike. This is a dispute with our employers over the use of insecure contracts, over pay gaps around gender and race, and over the attempt to downgrade our pension benefits. I'm not willing to break the strike, and I can't help but admit that the research, writing, and promotion of this book is part of my work as an academic at the University of Edinburgh. I like to think that this action is in the spirit of those who I write about in Escape from Earth, but I regret that it takes me away from the directness of meeting with you. I'm always delighted to hear from readers, so do let me know what you think. I hope you'll find this Caltech story as intriguing as I did. We are planning to set up a post-strike event where we will be able to invite him back and our two Caltech colleagues so that we can actually direct questions to him specifically. As soon as we know when that's going to take place, we will be communicating with all of the people who registered to be part of today's program. But I can tell you that there are no people better than Eric and Peter in terms of the knowledge of JPL. Their archives were very valuable to MacDonald. He told us so early on, and I know that they're going to be able to handle the questions later on. You will be able to submit your questions using the Q&A feature on your screen. Just jot them in there during the interview itself or immediately afterwards. I'll remind you at the end of the interview itself. Fraser is a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. Among his many writings, he really outdid himself with Escape from Earth. It is a fun and accessible read, and so now we're going to roll that interview that was recorded just before the strike, and I ask you to help me welcome, oddly, Fraser MacDonald and Eric Conway. Eric?
Well, Fraser, so we've met before. I'm Eric Conway. I'm in my lovely home office in Altadena, California, and blanked it out with this lovely sunset picture, which is actually from somewhere in Washington State. It might be San Juan Island. I think it's evening where you are in Scotland. And I'd likely to welcome you to this program Behind the Book at Caltech. So we can talk about your book, recently published. It is 2019, I think, called Escape from Earth, A Secret History of the Space Rocket. So welcome, Fraser. First, tell us briefly a little bit about yourself and then what your book is about.
Well, thanks so much for having me on this. It's great to be here. So yes, my name is Fraser MacDonald, and I am based in Scotland. I'm an academic at the University of Edinburgh. It is 8 o'clock at night here on a grey, rainy evening. So I've written this book, which is a history of early American space exploration. It's primarily centered around the character of Frank Molina. So I don't need to tell you as JPL's official historian who Frank Molina is, but the much, I think, underrated founder of JPL. And I came to be writing about Molina because I was, first of all, interested in a rocket testing station that was sited in the Scottish Hebrides. So this was a station that was built in the 1950s to test what I later discovered was the Corporal missile. And when I started to dig into this, and I was kind of fascinated by the history of nuclear testing in Scotland, close to where I was living. And the more I read, it was as if the less it made sense. That when I learned a bit more about JPL and its early history, there were just so many kind of unanswered questions. And I couldn't work out how Frank Molina, who by any measure is probably definitely the first person to successfully launch a high altitude rocket in America. He designed America's first successful space exploration program, and successful in the sense of getting to altitudes that were not previously reached by balloon technology. And I couldn't work out why he was not better known. And that took me to the kind of clouds of suspicion around him and the kind of intrigue around both the group of people he was working with at Caltech, and of course the group of people with whom he eventually founded JPL.
Thanks for that. So you're brought to this by a testing station in the UK for an American missile that was eventually deployed successfully for about a decade in Western Europe. And developed originally at JPL for the US Army when the laboratory was an Army contractor by and large. Great. Now this all starts in the 1930s. So kind of set the stage for us. Tell us about Frank Molina and his arrival in Pasadena in 1935.
So one of the things that interests me about Molina, he's very much the outsider. He is not from a privileged background at all. He is from a Czech immigrant family, musical rather than academic family. And he, first of all, does an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering, Texas A&M, and then decides he wants to go into engineering, but doesn't want a military career, which is what his father wants. So ends up at Caltech, I guess, inspired by the fact that so much is going on at Caltech. He, first of all, enrolls in a master's of mechanical engineering again. And of course, so much going on in Caltech in the 30s. And a lot of that is about the design of Robert Millikan, then president, trying to bring all these amazing scientific minds onto campus. So you've got Einstein, Heisenberg, Paul Dirac, all these quite remarkable figures, one of whom is the amazing aerodynamic engineer Theodor von Karman. And Karman is brought in order to give aerodynamics expertise at Caltech, but also to help the developing aviation industry. And so that's the world that Molina steps into. And he, first of all, starts as an assistant in the wind tunnel. And that's really how he comes into contact with von Karman, and learns very quickly that there's a different kind of school of engineering here, a particular school of engineering, which is very much about mathematical competence and mathematical approaches. And I think he's intrigued by that. But he kind of flits around for the first year before eventually starts thinking, I think the line in a letter to his parents is, wouldn't surprise me if I got my fingers mixed into rocket propulsion. If that didn't work, however, his backup plan was he was going to go to Russia. So that's a really kind of interesting and quite stark picture of he's kind of facing two ways, even in the mid-1930s. He's thinking about, wow, could there be such a thing as a rocket, and might I be able to contribute to that? And simultaneously thinking, wow, some really interesting things happening politically elsewhere in the world. And he's spending a lot of time reading newspapers, worried about fascism and so on, and thinking that kind of socialist politics might be one way, might be a scientific way of addressing some of these issues. So there's a lot going on in the 30s, of course, Great Depression, and he's just witness to a lot of quite difficult aspects of life in California: racial segregation, poverty, violence against labor unions, and so on. And so I get the sense that he just really wants to make a difference in the world at that time.
Right. And of course, this is the Great Depression in the United States and in Europe. And so there's also active active social justice movements and that sort of thing. I mean, in 1934, this is right up to Sinclair had run for governor of California on a really radical program, the End Poverty in California movement, known as EPIC, gets 38% of the vote, right? And so he settles into this context in which there's a lot of kind of activism. And so you've mentioned briefly for us that when he starts to work around von Karman and the mathematical emphasis of what was then called the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratories, GALCIT is what we call it today. It's now the Graduate Aerospace Laboratories, to get my word phrasing right here, partly because of Molina's work. But at the same time, he's interested in these radical politics. Tell us how he got involved with the radical politics of that era.
So, yeah, I think your mention of Upton Sinclair is a really interesting one, because I think that's the political world that Molina is coming into in Los Angeles when he comes from Texas. And the things that motivate him politically are, well, there are a few of them. One is that he's genuinely terrified by the rise in fascism. That's particularly true towards the end of the 30s. he is witnessing a lot of quite grim things going on in Los Angeles, the violence against organized labor, the kind of vigilantes against union meetings. I say this in the context of the fact that I can't help but pretend that I myself am involved in an industrial dispute with my employer right now, which is why I can't speak to you in person, which is a great regret of mine. But I like to think that I am fighting for an ideal of the university and an ideal of a kind of just reward for good work that Molina too would have shared. So I think Molina believes in that ideal of labor rights, and particularly the right to organize for migrant labor, fruit pickers in the Imperial Valley, this kind of thing. And I so think those sorts of things are profound influence on him, as are just the awfulness of racial segregation. So one of the things that really catalyzes his involvement in, as it turns out, the Communist Party is the nature of segregation in Pasadena. So if you were serious about making change in the mid to late 1930s, then the Communist Party is probably the main vehicle to do that, particularly after Upton Sinclair's epic failure, as it were. His platform wasn't electorally successful, but the coalition that he built was very much, had the momentum of a lot of people who supported the Communist Party behind it. So I think that that campaigning he did, along with others, to end the racial segregation of Pasadena swimming pool, where previously it had a blacks only session on a Wednesday afternoon, after which the pool was drained for whites to return on Thursday morning. That he found that so objectionable that along with other scientific colleagues around Caltech at that time, that includes people like Frank Oppenheimer, the brother, of course, of the slightly more famous J. Robert Oppenheimer, and a number of others, including Sidney Weinbaum, brilliant physicist who worked for Linus Pauling, who did all the calculative grunt work, working out the shape of polypeptide chains. Various other people, Jacob Dubnoff, Martin Summerfield, a variety of kind of biologists, engineers, physicists, who started to get together. Partly they met to discuss ideas, to discuss books they were reading, to discuss the news of the day. But increasingly it came under the auspices of a meeting, a formally convened meeting of Unit 122, which was called a professional unit of the Communist Party. And that was really organized by this figure, very interesting figure, I think, Sidney Weinbaum, who was originally from Ukraine, and chess player, concert level pianist, absolutely brilliant character, but was probably the most committed and organized of all of these scientists, and brought those scientists and engineers together at Caltech to be able to talk, to be involved in some activism, to discuss events of the day. And of course, they didn't necessarily realize that 20 years later, the FBI would become knocking on their laboratory doors, concerned about their political affiliation. But that was the 30s, right? It wasn't that controversial to be politically involved in that way, but obviously by the late 40s, totally different picture.
Yeah, becomes quite unacceptable in the American political scene, doesn't it? We need to keep the thread of the technical work going. So next, let's talk about how Molina starts working with rocketry. Talk about the troika of Molina and Parsons and Foreman.
So, well, I guess the first thing to say is that I think Molina did an incredible thing, really, which is to say, I think more than anybody else, he made rocketry scientifically respectable in the United States. I mean, we could argue about that, and you might have different ideas. The case could be made for Robert Goddard, obviously, and obviously Theodore von Karman. But it's Molina, actually, who really professionalizes, I think, rocketry into a domain that is populated by serious-minded engineers, not just like cranks and fantasists, which is the prior reputation of rocketry in the 1930s. But of course, the strange thing is, in order to make that happen, he does actually team up with people who probably are a little bit more along the crank and fantasist end of the spectrum, which is, famously Jack Parsons, a very charismatic, to my mind, a very troubling figure, well known in Los Angeles, and his Jack Parsons' school friend, Ed Foreman, and they have a quite long-standing interest in partly blowing things up, partly experimenting with detonation and deflagration and working out the differences between high explosives and low explosives and what you can do with such things. And Parsons was somebody who didn't work, he didn't have any kind of academic background, didn't even have a college degree, but worked in a chemicals explosives factory, and so had a real hands-on intuitive knowledge of materials that could be used as propellants. And they got attracted to Caltech, and this is a well-known story. They saw a newspaper article about a seminar that happened in Caltech by another student of von Karman, Bill Bolle. They rushed along to Caltech in excitement about what they could learn from these more academically prestigious engineers, only to be kind of defeated by the fact that Bill Bolle had no interest in him. And Theodore von Karman said, well, why don't you go and chat to this other PhD student, Frank Molina, or master's student as then was. And so this troika, Molina, Parsons, Foreman, teamed up, always an uneasy alliance, I think. Frank and Jack Parsons, they got on very well initially, but their relationship very quickly became strained. Foreman and Molina pretty much hated each other from the get-go, as far as I can tell. But they built something together, which was an experimental program under the guidance of von Karman, obviously, to try and build a viable rocket motor. And as you know, Eric, there's all this tension in the group between Parsons and Foreman, who just want to kind of let things off and go and shoot and create a kind of havoc and follow the charisma and excitement of a rocket launch, versus Molina, who's much more cautious, much more influenced by von Karman, and more concerned with, well, how could we really understand the dynamics of a rocket motor, which for Parsons and Foreman, I think, was not especially interesting. But they did some amazing work together, right?
Yep. And Molina starts to build a team around that troika of bringing in other more theoretically inclined people, right? Apollo Smith comes aboard very early on. Chen Shushen, someone else who we probably won't have time to talk about, but should, comes aboard because he's becomes a very big deal for both Caltech and when he's forced back to China, the People's Republic of China.
Right.
Builds their rocket and space program. He brings aboard several people and in order to make a go of it.
Right, and I think that just tells us something really interesting about Molina's role in the history of space exploration more generally, because normally, it's always an irritation for me that when we think of the history of space exploration in the US, the conventional story is, often you start with somebody like Robert Goddard, and then eventually you get to Wernher von Braun, and there's very little about Molina. But Goddard was in a way the lone wolf, right? He was an expert. He was a brilliant engineer, very, very, very clever guy, but worked with a kind of top-down model of engineering, where he just had a few assistants, right? Now Molina just knew that strategy was kind of doomed, partly because he was convinced, under the guidance of Theodore von Karman, a rocket was such a complicated entity that you needed so many different kinds of people to work on it. And that meant different mathematical expertise, different knowledge of propellants, people who could actually make components. And so that teamwork and the assembling of a big team, pulling in people like Tien, right? So Tien was just Frank Molina's office mate, and just overheard their kind of discussions, and then just get pulled into their discussions, and then not just into their discussions, into the work. And indeed, Tien and you and I have, we've chatted about this in the past, that Tian is such an important figure, not just in terms of the Chinese space program, but actually a very important figure in the founding of JPL itself. So arguably, von Karman, Molina, and Tian are really the key people in the founding of JPL. Despite the fact that Jack Parsons gets a lot of credit, and I would argue, perhaps controversially, but I think there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that Parsons had anything to do with the founding of JPL.
Yeah, his name is not on the famous proposal in 1943 that converts JPL from research into jet-assisted takeoff motors into ballistic missiles.
Right.
It's not there.
And he's not there in meetings. He's just not there. Like, he's not there.
Right.
And that's kind of, it's so amazing that I think that Parsons is he's very much more of a well-known figure, despite the fact that his contributions are, I think, much more modest, and particularly institutional contributions are very modest. I mean, I guess involved in the founding of Aerojet. We can talk about that another point. Anyway, yeah, no, I think that Parsons is his status and is vastly exaggerated. But yet, I think it's partly interesting that it is so, partly because people, I think, want to believe in that rocket engineering could come from the kind of wild card end of the spectrum, and rather than, in fact, very disciplined, highly mathematical, slightly dull end of the spectrum, perhaps.
Yeah, and since you brought up Aerojet, the story there is that the small crew of maybe 10 people, very successful under Army funding of developing jet-assisted takeoff motors, but then they want to manufacture them for the war effort. Right. And Caltech, Robert Millikan is like, no, we can't become a manufacturer for the war effort. So what happens? What do they do?
So I think, I mean, it's a reasonable position to take that universities shouldn't really be involved in manufacturing, weapons. So clearly, by this stage, which are now into the early 1940s, and they're trying to build these JTOs, jet-assisted takeoff, which again is kind of a long way from the earlier ideal of a rocket. Exactly, we're not talking about space exploration at this point. Really, we're just talking about trying to get a heavy jet off a short runway in the Pacific with a little bit of a rocket boost. And so this team that they've kind of assembled developed these very successful liquid and solid fuel JTOs. And I think the idea is, well, we might as well build a company that can manufacture these things. And after all, this is our intellectual property. Why not let do it? Why shouldn't we do it? I guess is the attitude, which isn't particularly surprising or isn't particularly paradoxical, other than Molina's a member of the Communist Party. And it's a delicious paradox that he is both later the world's first kind of space communist and the world's first space millionaire as a consequence of founding Aerojet. So Aerojet gets found, and it gets founded with von Karman, with Parsons, with Foreman, Summerfield too, but interestingly not Tian. In fact, I've never really quite found an adequate explanation for why Tian was not also brought to the party, not part of that corporate entity. But of course, Aerojet do important work. They develop these JTOs, and that's where Parsons and Molina kind of part company, which is that Parsons and Foreman, they end up working for Aerojet. Molina and Tian go on to found the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was much more both scientific and academic ideals, but also concerned with trying to develop weapons as well. Right.
And so this is the moment of conversion, kind of in 1943, when they begin to develop the space rocket, actually, that Foreman and Parsons had set out to do with Molina in 1936, and they quickly achieve it. Right, we're talking about the WAC Corporal here, which is first flown in 1945 in the fall. Right. So talk about that. Molina and his whole crew that are left by now in White Sands, testing that amazing vehicle.
Yeah, I think the WAC Corporal gets not nearly enough attention, because I really think it is an important moment in the history of astronautics. I mean, it's the world's first sounding rocket. It's the first rocket that really, in the United States at least, achieves the success of seriously high altitude, extreme altitude in Goddard's terms, flight. So the TheWAC Corporal is designed, when I say sounding rocket, just to clarify, that really means it's a rocket that's designed to, as a research vehicle to find out more about Earth's atmosphere. Of course, we don't know very much about Earth's atmosphere in many respects in the 1940s. And the TheWAC Corporal is very successful. It travels like to double the altitude that it's expected. But really, Molina is pretty much the only person left from the original crew to see that success. Parsons and Foreman are gone, Summerfield's working on other things, von Karman had moved east, I think, by that stage. And so it's Molina who really sees through the idea of let's build an American rocket. And I think that it's a profound moment, and is so for a number of other reasons, because it's when he goes to White Sands to test the TheWAC Corporal. He's flying over at the Trinity test site and is, I think, genuinely discomfited, like quite appalled at the realization of an atomic future, and an atomic future, a nuclear future, specifically for his vehicle. Because he knows that the TheWAC Corporal is just the first in a series of missiles that the US Army has planned. The next one, the Corporal missile, which is the main object here, which is a liquid-fueled rocket that is ultimately going to be designed as the means by which you could carry a nuclear warhead. And so the Corporal missile is in some sense a kind of obscure rocket now. Not many people will know about it. It's important because it's the world's first tactical nuclear missile. It's the first missile authorized to carry a nuclear warhead. And so it really feels like the progenitor of contemporary weapons of mass destruction, which, as we're speaking in whatever it is, March 2022, that conversation is back. So a lot of what was happening with, right, and a lot of what was happening with that moment feels like it has just real historical resonance, I guess.
So Frank Molina flies over the Trinity test sites in his visit to White Sands. And as you say, he's appalled by that coming linkage that he knows is what he's going to be tasked by the Army to do, is to develop a missile that will take nuclear weapons. So what does he do? I mean, he clearly doesn't want to do this for the Army. So what does he do?
Well, he's kind of stuck, isn't he? Because he's contractually obliged to see this through. But I would say that after, like, the week, it's the same week that he tests the TheWAC Corporal, that he then writes to Theodore von Karman saying, yeah, I want a break. I want to do something a bit different, a leave of absence. And I think the timing of that is very, very interesting, because I think he just really does have something of an epiphany at that moment, thinking, if I stay in America and just do rocketry, I'm just going to be building rockets for World War III. And so his solution to that is to try and find an escape route. It's also worth mentioning that he's not just like a brain on a stick. All engineers work with, in a particular environments of politics and culture and relationships, and his marriage is breaking down at this point, like really literally at this point. And I think that's one of the things I've tried to do in the book, is to write as if engineers have other things going on, that questions about their intimate lives, their relationships, their politics, their domesticity, these are not just like wallpaper, these are really active contexts in which engineering ideas take place. And so, like, I really think that personal stuff, both the personal and the political, are really important as contexts against which we can understand some of the engineering, right? And it's definitely true that Molina, his relationship not going well, he decides to leave and take a leave of absence in London initially. But then, of course, that takes him away and sees other places and people, and eventually, of course, he ends up in Paris.
He ends up in Paris working for UNESCO and Joseph Needham, who was very instrumental in the Science and Society movement of the 1930s.
So there's a weird echo, isn't there? I think because one of the things that I've written about is how Molina in the 30s, before any kind of serious rocket experiments are taking place, even before the famous Halloween test of the so-called Suicide Squad in October 31st, 1936, even before all that, he's meeting with other engineers to talk about the relationship between science and politics. And some of these people include people like Robert Oppenheimer. And so when it must be extraordinary, I think, what Molina must have thought of when he saw the Trinity test, because there he is, Molina, the primary architect of the rocket, who actually met Robert Oppenheimer, the primary architect of the atomic bomb, met Oppenheimer at a Communist Party meeting in the 30s to talk about the Pasadena swimming pool. So there's some strange echoes that later in his Molina's life, when he goes to London, meets people like Needham, he'd been reading Needham's work with his friends in Unit 122 in Pasadena. And so although Molina's his kind of environment changes and his emphasis on engineering changes, becomes much more concerned about the future of rocket engineering, but still finds the same sort of people who are kind of left-leaning, brilliant, interested in creating institutions that might affect change. UNESCO was one such. JPL arguably is another.
So we're getting short on time, but I have to ask you kind of the end of Molina's pursuit, really, by the FBI. And so it's in 1947, the FBI finally decides to take a serious interest in Frank Molina. And so what I want you to talk about is, first off, what changed that finally caused them to come after him? And then the second thing is what is it like for the family that he starts in Paris?
Wow, right. So Molina moves to Paris, becomes one of the key people in starting this organization, UNESCO. But the FBI are onto him. And the reason that's happened, I mean, you can point to various things, various kind of changes along the way. One significant thing is 1947, that Truman has this executive order that basically creates loyalty review boards. It permits an executive order, I think 9835, or it creates the possibility of looking into anybody's kind of security record on the flimsiest pretext. And that meant FBI were looking into tons of engineers. It's true for those in Los Alamos, true for those in JPL. And the more they looked into it, the more suspect things they found. That's to say, they found at JPL employees who wanted to vote for Henry Wallace in the 1948 presidential election, because Wallace was campaigning against racial segregation. He was campaigning for universal health care, campaigning for a less antagonistic relationship with the Soviet Union. And so one of the things that was going on then is that the FBI were concerned about there being a number of what you might call activist engineers within JPL. And that happened because the subsequent director of JPL after Frank Molina, a guy called Louis Dunn, he basically walked into an FBI office in January 1949 and said, look, I think there's a spy ring at JPL. It wasn't just about the politics. It was about the loyalty of some of JPL's employees. And that was what was really in the frame. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those people who were being accused of potentially being spies were either Jewish or Chinese, or in one case, a woman. right? And so I think that a lot of these accusations reflected the prejudices of the time, but it meant that the FBI massively scaled up the extent of their investigations. And that had huge implications for all of these engineers, many of which lost clearances, therefore lost jobs, some of whom ended up in prison for various kind of, I think, rather mean-spirited reasons. And for Molina himself, your second question was about, what was it like for him to live through this? He did not have an easy time. Like, for sure, he lived under a lot of uncertainty and fear. He eventually, the US State Department pressurized UNESCO to sack him, because the mechanism they used to do this was what was called the Personnel Security Questionnaire. So they basically got Molina insisted that Molina and other employees fill out these questionnaires, in which the key question was, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? So it was pretty hard, but Molina had it a lot easier than many of his colleagues, particularly Sidney Weinbaum. And the most extraordinary thing, I think, is this weird thing where at the very moment when Molina gets fired from UNESCO, he accidentally becomes an overnight millionaire. Now, how does that happen? I mean, it's so improbable that Aerojet gets taken over by General Tire. Somebody tries to persuade Molina to sell his shares at a discounted price, but they can't really contact him very easily. Molina keeps his shares and overnight becomes a millionaire. I think von Karman writes in his biography, his autobiography, a chapter called "How I Lost $12 Million," because von Karman didn't keep the same shareholding that Molina did. So that wealth insulated, I think, Frank Molina from a lot of the otherwise very adverse consequences of what was a pretty grim system of surveillance, of confidential informants, of friends, talking to the FBI about other friends, colleagues talking to the FBI about other colleagues. And we know now, of course, that Parsons himself was one of those confidential informants. In other words, Parsons was an FBI rat.
So we're just about out of time, but I want you to talk about how you were able to write this book. What resources were available for you to be able to tell us so much about what happened, about Molina and what happened to him?
Wow. So, I mean, I could talk altogether too long about that, but I guess
yes.
Any historian, and I don't need to tell you about this because you know this actually better than I do in terms of, as JPL's official historian, you can only work with the archives that you have, right? But I had this sort of strange position of thinking initially that I was going to come to this story too late because all the people I was writing about were dead. Actually, the opposite was true. Yes, the people were dead, but it meant that they were now no longer able to actively suppress material that might not have come to light. So the next generation were in possession of private personal archives that told a much fuller story about Molina, his politics, his intimacies, and so on. And that reflects kind of how I work as a historian. I actually started my academic life as a jobbing social scientist, as an ethnographer, and I liked speaking to people. And I think that doing a lot of the oral history work and speaking to the families of the people who were involved in either in JPL or involved in the Communist Party, that was absolutely eye-opening. And not just getting new information, but also finding a renewed motivation to tell this story because other people started to become involved in trying to help piece this together. But obviously dependent too on Caltech's own archives and the amazing work done by people like Judith Goodstein and Mary Terrell over the years, who'd done loads of oral history work with Caltech scientists at a time when I don't think they necessarily would have understood the full significance of a lot of these oral history interviews when they were being done in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But for my generation of historians, that's been an incredible resource that I've been able to use. So very grateful for the labors of previous generations of archivists and oral historians.
Thank you, Fraser. I'm afraid we're out of our time, but thank you very much for participating in this. It's a wonderful book, very informative to me, and I've used it a great deal. I hope our audience will find it amazing, insightful too.
Thanks so much, Eric, and I'm just so delighted to be able to chat to a Caltech audience.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This was just an absolutely fascinating interview for me. And I want to thank everybody involved who had to help us get the recording done about a week and a half ago so that we could share this with you on the scheduled night. I want to remind you that you can post your questions to the Q&A feature on your screen. And also you can sign up to join our mailing list and get information on David Anderson's new book, The Nature of the Beast. And I've got to hold it right in front of my face so you get to see the full book there. And that's going to be on the 17th of May, again at 5 o'clock. Now I'm going to introduce Caltech's archivist, Peter Callipy, and JPL's historian, Eric Conway, who Malcolm has just praised both their particular offices and those guys personally for the kind of assistance that he had and the relationship that he was able to build with them. Raul Espinoza, who has been spearheading our communications efforts since last year, will be coordinating the Q&A. Just to confirm, Caltech created the Jet Propulsion Lab, which is now owned by NASA, but it is operated by Caltech. Now I turn the Q&A over to Raul Espinoza.
Thank you, Michael. Actually, I'd like to bring Eric back on, and I'm just going to toss some questions after he has a conversation with Peter, if that's okay with you. And I will toss him the questions that are in the Q&A section here for them to answer. Eric? There you are. Hey, yeah, Eric, yeah. Thank you. Listen, there are some questions, and I'm going to toss out the very first question that came in about 20 minutes ago, I think it was, and is from David Seidel, and he asks, if Parsons hadn't come along, would Molina have gotten far enough along in rocket research that JPL would have been developed?
Hi, David. And tough question. It was one of those counterfactuals. The question really, I think, would have to be a little bit different. Without Parsons informing him, approaching him, would he ever have bothered going into rocketry? And I really don't have any way of knowing. He saw the same talk with Bill Belay, so maybe he would have had similar sorts of motivations. There would still have been a war, and he might well have gotten enticed back into working in these sort of rocketry areas. By that, as I know David knows, but maybe the rest of the audience doesn't, the Caltech physics department actually did become a major manufacturer of weapons during World War II. It made solid fuel rockets of all kinds of size scales. By the end of the war, had 7,000 people making rockets for the war effort, scattered around Pasadena. And he might well have been involved in that, but it might well be true that there would be no JPL. But again, counterfactual, we can never know. It's possible that the Army would have gotten von Karman to do it anyway.
Well, excellent. Why don't I actually bring Peter in as well?
Yeah.
So we can have an opportunity to have you have a conversation with him, and then I'll read a few more questions while he comes on. Is that okay with you, Peter, there?
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Yes. So I as university archivist at Caltech, lead a team that develops collections and provides access to them and interprets them in order to help audiences of all sorts understand Caltech's history. And I think this book is such a good advertisement for archives. As Eric and Fraser were discussing at the end of their conversation, writing this kind of historical account depends on access to records of the past, which often are secret, whether they're private or institutionally confidential or classified or otherwise unavailable in their own times. And there are all sorts of things that historians can learn many decades after events that might be unknown even to participants in those events themselves. And so I'll just talk a little bit, very briefly, about what we have at the Caltech Archives and how it relates to some of the conversation that we heard between Fraser and Eric. So we have many sorts of collections here. We have rare books, we have art, we have photographs like the one behind me, which is a model of an XF-87 jet fighter in Galsit's wind tunnel, the same wind tunnel in which Molina worked early in his career. We have scientific instruments, institutional records, but the strongest area of our collections is papers of Caltech researchers, things like letters between scientists, laboratory notebooks, the unpublished documentation of how science is done, how engineering is done, and the lives of the people who do it. JPL also has distinct archives. JPL and Caltech are the same organization, but administratively separate in many important ways. And one of those is in terms of archives. But much early JPL history is here at the Caltech Archives because it predates the establishment of the JPL Archives. And so if you read MacDonald's endnotes carefully, you'll find the use of resources at many different repositories. I also want to mention that the oral history program that that Fraser spoke so enthusiastically and generously about is an ongoing program, and the oral histories that he consulted for this project are decades old, but that program continues with interviews both by Caltech Archives' own Heidi Aspaturian and by David Zieler, who's director of the Caltech Heritage Project, who's a collaborator outside the archives. And I'll put a link to the chat in the chat to the oral history collection, because that is a really rich source of documentation of Caltech's past, which we always welcome engagement with. So I will, I think, hand it back to Eric if there's anything you want to add, or if we want to go on to audience questions.
Oh, I would just comment that the JPL archives, which we do have, is a little more restricted in both its accessibility by well, technical requirements, State Department rules about accessing foreign access to technologies and so forth, but also because we by and large don't collect the papers of individuals. We're required to collect project records, and very secondarily, we do keep our directors' papers. So we, unfortunately, we have most of our JPL directors' papers. We actually do not have Louis Dunn's. As far as I know, there are none. And just as there are no interviews with him that either of us have, unless Peter's holding out, and I don't think he is. So they're crucial resources. That said, though, one thing Fraser didn't quite bring out is that some of the records he had access to, neither of us do. The Molina family records are still belong to the family. So what we have are institutional records of their times, of people talking about them and so forth. But that key little family history, we don't have. On the other hand, though, we have access to FBI records that Frank Molina never had. Because all that stuff has largely been released and cannot be released until the death of the person being investigated. That's the rule in the FBI. And so, Michael, or sorry, Raul, we can take some questions.
Well, absolutely. And thank you both, gentlemen, for highlighting what it is you do at your respective institutions there. One of them is a comment, and which you can comment on, and it's by AC. It says, finally, a mention of acknowledgement and recognition for Hu Shen-Xing. Sorry if I mispronounced that. America shooting itself in the foot. Of course, a companion must-read book to Fraser MacDonald's book is The Thread of the Silkworm by Iris Chang.
Oh, indeed. Chen Shushen, I still am pronouncing it incorrectly because, well, I was raised in a French-speaking part of the United States, not one with or any Chinese population. It was a crucial figure, both for JPL and as I hope we communicated, when he is forced back to China for the People's Republic of China, developing their missile program and then later on their space program. I've used Thread of the Silkworm myself as much as I can. I still hope, though, that someday we get a good history of Chen Shushen, or a good biography from Chen Shushen out of China, because I'm pretty darn sure when he returned, he took his correspondence with his father with him. And that, I think, would fill in a lot of holes we have in our stories about JPL itself.
Thank you. So here is another question. This is from Mohammed Tirani. Did Parsons go on to start a construction engineering company? Either one of you can take that.
No, different Parsons.
Got it.
Yeah, Jack Parsons blew himself up in his mother's house in, I believe it's 1952. He, at the time, was planning to move to Mexico. He had suddenly taken on some consulting work for special effects in Hollywood too, and he was mixing some chemicals that explode on when you drop them, and that's what happened. I'm forgetting what the name of it was, but that was the end of Jack Parsons' story.
Oh, got it. All right, here's one from Dennis Posake. I apologize, Dennis. The question is, when Molina showed up, were Caltech professors still on the board of the Eugenics Society? Who wants to take that question?
Sure. Yes, they were. Caltech had an overlapping leadership with the Human Betterment Foundation, which was an organization based in Pasadena that advocated for the involuntary sterilization of people with disabilities, of people who were imprisoned, so yes. For example, the Human Betterment Foundation exists until 1942 and then dissolves and hands off its assets to Caltech in 1943. Caltech professors were on its board throughout its history from 1928 to 1942. So the answer to that question is a pretty straightforward yes, they were.
Got it. So this one's from Tom Britton. The next question, he asks, how pervasive and deployed were tactical rockets in World War II?
Oh, so the physics department rockets, I think, is what he's probably talking about. I actually don't know that much about the European War, but in the Pacific War, extremely heavily. If you ever see World War II Pacific War movies, they show you the beach assaults and their bombardment rockets being used in those, and that was Caltech's product. Those bombardment rockets were developed by the physics department rocket project. For you lifer Caltechers, this was read by the Lauritsons, or the people who initiated and ran that program throughout the war. They also developed the first air-launched tactical rockets, air-to-surface rockets, and that is the origin actually of China Lake, up further north of here, a couple hours, in Inyokern. So Caltech can claim to have founded rocketry in both the Army and the Navy if it wants to.
And I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but the number of those rockets that Caltech produced during World War II was really enormous.
It was over 1 million. There's
yeah.
actually a picture with, I think it's Richard Tolman, standing with the 1 millionth rocket.
Excellent.
So I think the answer to how pervasive they were based on the number produced, extremely so.
Yeah.
Perfect. So here's a comment from David Brancaccio. He says, Frank Molina had several more acts in his life as a pioneering artist based in Paris. Also, as you comment on the significance of the journal Molina founded, Leonardo, which exists even today.
Absolutely. So yes, Frank Molina, after leaving UNESCO, went on to a career in kinetic art, building sculptures that incorporated motion and light and other elements that he translated over from his engineering career. And there's been some recent scholarship on Molina. Patrick McRae's book, Making Art Work, which I reviewed in the Los Angeles Review of Books, has a chapter on Molina's artistic career, which I think that chapter forms a good sequel to Escape from Earth, because Fraser MacDonald doesn't follow Molina all that far into that later career. And one of the things that Molina did in that new role as an artist was to found a journal for artists, as Brancaccio refers to, called Leonardo, which does indeed still exist even today. And Molina founded this journal in part with the idea that something that he admired about scientists particularly was the open publication. This is something we see in this story as well, and a concern that he constantly had about secret military engineering. He really admired the open publication of knowledge. And he wanted artists who were developing new techniques to similarly openly publish their processes and make them available to other artists. So Leonardo was and became a sort of journal of art and science, where people working at those intersections, also of art and technology, published accounts of their work. But he saw it as a sort of scientific journal for artists that would have a similar role, and it has continued to play that role. It continues to be a journal in that field.
Thank you. I have a few more questions. This one, again by David Seidel, says, was Parsons' contribution to JPL that he motivated and energized the rocketry effort but within GALCIT, and JPL was a consequence of that success?
So I guess it's important to note that Parsons and Foreman were never part of Caltech.
Okay.
They were independent rocketeers, really, hobbyists and enthusiasts. Not clear to me that anyone else but Molina ever took them very seriously. Von Karman doesn't talk much about them, for example. But again, as we've said, it's the meeting of those three that gets the jet assisted. Well, sorry, it's a meeting of those three that get them first working on the motor, the alcohol and oxygen motor that they first build. Actually, Foreman puts together for them, and that they test in those first 4 tests, and then those two join Molina on campus as essentially research assistants. Until the Army money starts to come in 1939, late 1939, early 1940. So they certainly motivated some level of rocketry interests, but it's, of course, the war that brings serious money. I wonder if it would have not have simply fizzled out if there had not been World War II, because there wasn't really that much interest amongst the rest of the GALCIT staff.
Peter, did you want to comment on that? I saw you nodding.
I might just add that I think it is an element of Caltech history, and this is probably typical of research universities, that there are hangers-on who form a part of the history of the institution, that there are people who have no formal affiliation, but nonetheless are engaged persistently enough in the institution's activities that they're relevant to sort of understanding the place. And so I think that Parsons and Foreman are examples of these sort of figures who don't have official recognition from the institution, but nonetheless are engaged with it.
Got it. Thank you. So let's see. Here's our next question. Was there an active Communist Party membership at Caltech, including at the leadership level?
Yes, to the active membership at Caltech. I wouldn't say leadership level unless Peter knows more than I do. I think that the Millicans were quite the opposite in political temperament.
Yeah, I think one thing that that MacDonald emphasizes in his account of the various Communist Party members at Caltech was the leadership role among that group of Sidney Weinbaum, who worked for, unless I'm making a mistake in my memory, who worked for Linus Pauling.
For Linus Pauling, yeah.
Absolutely. And who was himself a physicist, but worked in chemistry at Caltech. And so MacDonald certainly portrays him as having a leadership role within that particular small group of communist scientists and other professionals in Pasadena, but not a leadership role in the National Communist Party. There wasn't anyone at Caltech who rose to that level of importance in CPUSA.
Yeah.
There are some really nice details about the organization of the Communist Party in Pasadena in this book that I might point to. One is that there were meetings on different nights of the week attended by different people, and only a few people knew who all of the attendees were throughout all the different meetings. So for the most part, individual members of the party only knew fellow members on their own night of the week. They only knew, maybe 1/5 or whatever of the fellow members in that group. And so there's some sense that the book provides of particularly how the Communist Party organized scientists and engineers, as opposed to how they organized people with more manual professions in other kinds of sectors of the labor market.
Great. Now here's somebody requesting that either one of you comment on, and excuse me if I mispronounce this, Keon Zuzen's role in the founding of JPL.
Oh, that's Chen Shushen still. That's a different alliteration than you're used to. That's all.
Okay.
Chen, same thing. So the 1943 proposal that converts JPL from doing the jet assisted takeoff work into doing ballistic missile work. The three names on that proposal were, in order, Theodore von Karman, Chen Shushen, and Frank Molina. So Chen was the second named person, and he wrote the proposal that's more technical and mathematical than von Karman's first one, which was more almost more programmatic, if that makes sense. It was more aimed at Army brass and less at other engineers, if you want to think of it that way. So if you can think of the idea of maybe of JPL's reform into the weapons lab, it's actually Chen and Molina who are the key actors there. By that time, this is like in the late 1943, Parsons and Foreman are gone. They went to Aerojet when Aerojet was formed in 1942.
So there's a follow-up to that, and that is, did the U.S. blow it by exiling him?
Oh, I think lots of people think so. And I would say, how do I want to put this? The Chinese would still ultimately have developed a missile program, probably getting Chen Shushen back, gave them a few years more of a head start than they would have otherwise. But no one person, we were saying with Fraser MacDonald, these are all about teams. There are other people who would develop expertise in China, and that when Chen went back, he could draw on already. So he was able to take a leadership role, but they would still have developed a missile program, but maybe it would have taken them 3 or 5 years longer. That's how I think I would put it.
Got it. Anything to add to that, Peter?
One thing I would add, again, correct me if I'm remembering incorrectly, Eric, but I think that MacDonald is pretty persuaded in his account that Chen was a member of the Communist Party. And I know that this has been a historical controversy, and that some people have seen his exile from the United States as mistaken based on the question of whether he was a communist.
Yeah, so Fraser is very persuaded. The reason I'm less so is just a matter of evidence. The evidence against both Chen and Molina amounts to membership cards that the Los Angeles Police Department were copied from originals by undercover police officers belonging to their Red Squad, which is a group put together specifically for union busting activities, literally, and tracing down communists in Los Angeles. At Chen's immigration hearing after the war, Caltech hired an attorney to defend him. And that attorney pretty thoroughly discredited these cards by the expedient of getting the police claimed that a homeowner was in possession of these, and they had permission from the homeowner to copy these records. So the immigration court brought in the homeowner who said, we don't know anything about this. So either the police were lying to the court or the homeowners were lying to the court, but someone wasn't telling the truth. And if you're concerned about chains of evidence, this is pretty poor, pretty weak sauce, because they're copies, they're not originals, and the provenance is now in question. All that said, when he went back, when Chen went back to China, he did join the party. He had to have joined the party in order to have any power and possibly not wind up in jail himself. And so I always come back to the question, not whether they were members of the party, because it's arguable and it will always be, but whether there's new evidence that they actually were traitors. Were they actually sharing information that they shouldn't have been sharing? And you know, we now have more information than was available in 1970, and there's just no evidence that they were. And so that's where I want to conclude that long and painful answer.
Understand. Here's the last question. I don't know where we are on time, but I think we're still good. So the question is, actually, there's two more questions. Didn't Freeman Dyson demonstrate the nuclear bomb rocket at Caltech?
Design there, never demonstrated. I read that book of his too, or what was it, his son's? But yeah, I know what you're talking about. There was an effort by Molina's crew. The theory actually came from something Chen wrote about using discrete explosive to power a rocket. And they actually tried to build this with chemical explosives, but they weren't able to come up with a mechanism to do it. And Dyson's nuclear rocket is similar in that regard. You have to be able to feed the bombs in some kind of sequence, and at least with 1930s mechanisms, they couldn't quite come up with a way to do it. But there is a line of thought there. Peter may know more about the Dyson case, though.
I don't. And Caltech is not one of the institutions to which Dyson was connected for most of his career. So I don't know more detail on that, or whether it would have been here or elsewhere.
Okay, great. So this one, I think it's actually it's a statement. The statement says Parsons was involved in a sex magic cult.
Yes, he was indeed.
And that story is told in Escape from Earth, as well as in a couple of other books, which Escape from Earth cites.
Yep.
So yes, it was an important, for Parsons, it was an important portion of his work and time that he was engaged in occult activities. MacDonald also, you may have noticed in the video, he refers to Parsons as a troubling character. And one of the things that he emphasizes in his account of Parsons was the role of rape in that sex magic cult, which is something that hasn't been emphasized by more sympathetic accounts of the cult. So Parsons does not come off well in Escape from Earth, whether you are pro-magic or anti-magic. The particular ways in which he did it do not seem ethical. But that was an important pursuit of his that was parallel to his work on explosives. Yeah. And another thing that I think MacDonald really conveys is that Frank Molina was totally uninterested in Parsons' sex magic and just saw it as his hobby that he was doing on the side, and not as something to be concerned about. But other people in Molina's orbit, including his first wife, did become much more interested in Parsons' magic and spent time in that community as well.
Yeah. At the same time, I think that helped color a lot of the community at JPL and Rocketdyne, or sorry, Aerojet, not Rocketdyne, against Parsons, because lots of people thought that the kinds of things he were involved in were just beyond the pale, and no right-thinking American should be involved in those sorts of things. So I do think it helped drive Parsons out of the realm of the acceptable at Aerojet.
Very good. Thank you, Wendy, for making that comment. So I have another comment. This one's from Alexander Geppert. It says, Keon was only allowed to join the Communist Party in 1958, which in itself is not an easy process, Eric. Otherwise, great conversation. Thank you. And so bad that MacDonald could not join us in person and live. That's Alexander Geppert.
Thanks, Alex.
Very good. I actually would like to ask Michael to come back in. That's the last question. I don't know, Michael, if you have any questions for our two panelists, and then I'll just let you close out the rest of the event. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, I want to thank Eric, Peter, Raul. But before I do, in my readings about Chen, much of it in the book, he was not a U.S. citizen, and so he was held he was sort of held under house arrest for about 5 years, and finally went back to China, not because he was freed up so much as it was part of a prisoner exchange of some sort, I think in the late 40s, early 50s. I was told my first week at Caltech, somebody that was high up in the administration told me one of the biggest mistakes Caltech made was not fighting to keep him in this country. Can you confirm anything about that prisoner exchange, gentlemen?
So that has come up many times, and so far nobody's found kind of the smoking gun document. That is, in Thread of the Silkworm, for example, there's kind of two threads of the story. He was set up to be deported, but ultimately there's this discussion about exchanging him for prisoners from the Korean War. Yeah, but there's also another thread that the U.S. had withheld some other Chinese nationals, and there was supposed to be an exchange of these things too. So it's a bit of a complicated story that I can't sort through here. But what the impression I came out of with from Thread of the Silkworm is that Chang hadn't found, the killer document that has Dwight Eisenhower saying, okay, these 3 men can go back in exchange for. And so there's the story we typically have stuck to is the deportation.
Well, thank you both. And I hope audience members will realize that we have a real treasure, not just in the two of you, but in the history, the archives that you both are maintaining, and that it is in some ways a public resource that they can take advantage of if they're researching history, if they're doing research on science, something that Caltech is very, very proud of. I do want to remind everybody that you can go to events.caltech.edu to find out about our upcoming events. We've got the science journeys that are just great for those of you who stopped studying science during your undergraduate years or maybe even in high school, because these lectures in our program are fantastic and they don't talk down to people. They just make these junior high and high school kids reach higher and maybe dream of becoming Caltech students themselves. We've got a Behind the Book series coming up. We've got our Movies That Matter coming up, 3 series that we're doing virtually, and we invite you to go to that website, find out. You can sign up to be part of them. And I look forward to seeing you again. We'll let you know when Malcolm is available so we can do a Q&A that'll involve him as well. But thank you all so much, and everybody who is involved in this production. And we look forward to seeing you again in May. Good evening and have a safe night.